The dolorous passion and death of our Lord Jesus Christ. Chapter 11. The arrest of the Lord. When Jesus with the 3 apostles went out upon the road between Gethsemane and the Garden of Olives, there appeared at the entrance, about 20 paces ahead, Judas and the band of soldiers, between whom a quarrel had arisen. Judas wanted to separate from the soldiers and go forward alone to Jesus, as if he were a friend returning after an absence. They were to follow and act in such a way as to make it appear that their coming was altogether unknown to him. But they would not agree to his proposal. They held him fast, exclaiming, "Not so, friend! Thou shalt not escape us until we have the Galilean." And when they caught sight of the 8 apostles, who at sound of the noise came forth from the Garden of Gethsemane, they called up 4 of the archers to their assistance. But this Judas by no means assented to, and a lively dispute arose between him and the soldiers. When Jesus and the 3 apostles, by the light of the torches, distinguished the armed and wrangling band, Peter wished to repel them by force. He exclaimed, "Lord, the 8 from Gethsemane are close at hand. Let us make an attack on the archers." But Jesus told him to hold his peace, and took a few steps with them back on the road to a green plot. Judas, seeing his plans quite upset, was filled with rage and spite. Just at this moment, 4 of the disciples issued from the Garden of Gethsemane and inquired what was going on. Judas began to exchange words with them, and would fain have cleared himself by a lie, but the guards would not allow him to go on. These 4 last comers were James the Less, Philip, Thomas, and Nathanael. The last named, who was a son of the aged Simeon, had along with several others been sent by Jesus' friends to the 8 apostles in the Garden of Gethsemane to find out what was going on. They were actuated as much by anxiety as by curiosity. With the exception of these 4, all the disciples were straggling around in the distance, furtively on the lookout to discover what they could. Jesus took some steps toward the band and said in a loud, distinct voice, "Whom seek ye?" The leaders answered, "Jesus of Nazareth," whereupon Jesus replied, "I am he." But scarcely had he uttered the words when, as if suddenly attacked by convulsions, they crowded back and fell to the ground, one upon another. Judas, who was still standing by them, became more and more embarrassed. He looked as if desirous of approaching Jesus. Consequently, the Lord extended his hand, saying, "Friend, whereto art thou come?" Judas, confused and perplexed, stammered out something about a commission he had executed. Jesus, in reply, uttered some words like the following, "Oh, how much better it would have been for thee hadst thou never been born." I cannot remember the words distinctly. Meanwhile, the soldiers had risen and approached the Lord and his apostles, awaiting the traitor's sign, the kiss. Peter and the other disciples gathered around Judas, calling him a thief and a traitor. He tried to free himself by all kinds of excuses, but just at that moment up came the soldiers with offers of protection, thus openly witnessing against him. Jesus again inquired, "Whom seek ye?" Turning toward him, they again answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus again replied, "I am he. I have already told you that I am he. If you seek me, let these go." At the words, "I am he," the soldiers fell to the ground a second time. They writhed as if struck with epilepsy, and Judas was again surrounded by the other apostles, for they were exasperated to a degree against him. Jesus now called out to the soldiers, "Arise!" And they arose, full of terror. Judas was still struggling with the apostles, who were pressing up against the guards. The latter turned upon them and freed the traitor, urging him anew to give them the sign agreed upon. They had been ordered to seize no one but him whom Judas would kiss. Judas now approached Jesus embraced him and kissed him with the words, "Hail, Rabbi." Jesus said, "Judas, dost thou betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" The soldiers instantly formed a circle around Jesus, and the archers, drawing near, laid hands upon him. Judas wanted at once to flee, but the apostles would not allow him. They rushed upon the soldiers, crying out, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" Peter, more impetuous than the rest, seized the sword and struck at Malchus, the servant of the high priest, who was trying to drive them back, and cut off a piece of his ear. Malchus fell to the ground, thereby increasing the confusion. At the moment of Peter's impetuous movement, the actors in the scene were situated as follows. Jesus was in the hands of the guard, who were about to bind him, and forming a circle around him at some little distance were the soldiers, one of whose number, Malchus, had been laid low by Peter. The other soldiers were engaged, some in driving back the disciples that were approaching too near, and some in pursuing those that had taken to flight. 4 of the disciples were wandering around, timidly showing themselves only here and there in the distance. The soldiers were still too much alarmed by their late fall, and too much afraid of weakening the circle around Jesus, to make any very active pursuit. Judas, who immediately after his traitorous kiss wanted to make his escape, was met on his way by some of the disciples, who overwhelmed him with reproaches. 6 official functionaries hastened to his rescue, while the 4 guards were busy around Jesus with cords and bands, being on the point of binding him. This was the state of affairs when Peter struck down Malchus, and Jesus said, "Peter, put up thy sword, for whoever takes the sword shall perish by the sword. Thinkest thou that I cannot ask my Father to send me more than 12 legions of angels? Shall I not drink the chalice that my Father has given me? How will the Scriptures be fulfilled if it shall not thus be done?" Then he added, "Suffer me to heal the man." And going to Malchus, he touched his ear and prayed, and at the same moment it was healed. The guard, the executioners, and the 6 officers surrounded Jesus. They mocked him, saying to the crowd, "He has dealings with the devil. It was by witchcraft that the ear appeared to be cut off, and now by witchcraft it appears to be healed." Then Jesus addressed them, "Ye are come out with spears and clubs to apprehend me as if I were a murderer. I have daily taught among you in the temple, and ye dared not lay hands upon me. But this is your hour and the hour of darkness." They ordered him to be bound still more securely, and said to him deridingly, "Thou couldst not overthrow us by thy sorcery." And the archers said, "We shall deprive thee of thy skill." Jesus made some reply that I cannot recall, and the disciples fled on all sides. The 4 executioners and the 6 Pharisees did not fall to the ground, nor did they in consequence rise again. The reason of this was revealed to me. They were in the same rank as Judas, that is, entirely in the power of Satan. Judas did not fall at the words of Jesus, although he was standing among the soldiers. All those that fell and rose up again were afterward converted and became Christians. Their falling and rising were symbolical of their conversion. They had not laid hands upon Jesus. They merely stood around him. Malchus was, after his healing, already converted to such a degree that he only kept up appearances in respect to the service he owed the high priest. And during the following hours, those of Jesus' passion, he ran backward and forward to Mary and the other friends, giving them news of all that was taking place. The executioners bound Jesus with the greatest rudeness and barbarous brutality, the Pharisees meanwhile uttering insolent and scornful words. The executioners were pagans of the very lowest class. Their necks, legs, and arms were naked. Their loins were girded with a sort of bandage, and they wore a short jerkin without sleeves, fastened at the sides with straps. They were short, stout, very active, with a brownish-red complexion like the Egyptian slaves. They bound Jesus' hands upon his breast in a cruel manner. With sharp new cords, they pitilessly fastened the wrist of the right hand to the left forearm just below the elbow, and that of the left hand to the right forearm. They put around his waist a broad girdle armed with sharp points, and bound his hands again with links of willow or osier, which were fixed to the girdle. Around his neck they laid a collar in which were points and other instruments to wound, and from it depended 2 straps, which like a stole were crossed over the breast and bound down to the girdle so tightly that the neck was not free to move. At 4 points of this girdle were fastened 4 long ropes, by means of which the executioners could drag our Lord hither and thither according to their wicked will. All the fetters were perfectly new. They appeared to have been especially prepared when the plan was formed of apprehending Jesus for the purpose to which they were now being put. And now, after several more torches had been lighted, the pitiable procession was set in motion. First went 10 of the guard, then followed the executioners dragging Jesus by the ropes. Next came the scoffing Pharisees, and the 10 other soldiers closed the procession. The disciples were still straying about wailing and lamenting, as if bereft of their senses. John, however, was following rather closely behind the last of the guards. The Pharisees, seeing him, ordered him to be seized. At this command, some of the guard turned and hurried after him, but he fled from them, and when they laid hold of the linen scarf he wore around his neck, he loosened it quickly and thus effected his escape. He had laid aside his mantle, retaining nothing but a short, sleeveless undergarment, that he might be able to flee more easily. Around his neck, head, and arms, however, he was enveloped in that long, narrow scarf which the Jews were accustomed to wear. The executioners dragged and ill-used Jesus in the most cruel manner. They exercised upon him all kinds of malice, and this principally from a base deference and desire to please the 6 officials, who were full of rage and venom against him. They led him along the roughest roads, over ruts and stones and mire, keeping the long ropes stretched while they themselves sought good paths. In this way, Jesus had to go wherever the ropes would allow him. His tormentors carried in their hands knotted cords with which they struck him, as a butcher might do the animal he was leading to slaughter. All this they accompanied with mockery and insult so low and indecent that the repetition of it would be revolting. Jesus was barefoot. Besides the usual undergarment, he wore a seamless woolen shirt or blouse, and over that an outside robe. The undergarment of the disciples, like that of the Jews in general, consisted of a scapular that fell before and behind over the breast and shoulders. It was made of 2 pieces fastened together on the shoulder by straps, but open at the sides. The lower part of the body was covered with a girdle from which hung 4 lappets, which after being wound around the loins, formed a sort of trousers. I must not forget to say that, at the apprehension of the Lord, I saw no written order. His enemies went to work as if he were an outlaw, a person beyond the pale of the law. The procession moved on at a hurried pace. When it left the road between the Garden of Olives and the pleasure garden of Gethsemane, it turned for a short distance to the right on the west side of Gethsemane, until it reached a bridge that there crossed the brook Cedron. When Jesus was coming with the apostles to the Mount of Olives, he did not cross that bridge. He took a roundabout way through the valley of Josaphat and crossed the brook over a bridge farther to the south. That over which he was now led in fetters was very long, since it spanned not only the Cedron, which flowed here close to the mount, but also a part of the uneven heights of the valley, thus forming a paved highway for transportation. Even before the procession reached the bridge, I saw Jesus fall to the earth twice, owing to the pitiless manner in which he was dragged along and the jerking of the executioners at the ropes. But when they reached the middle of the bridge, they exercised their villainy upon him with still greater malice. The executioners pushed poor, fettered Jesus, whom they held fast with ropes, from the bridge into the brook Cedron, about the height of a man below, accompanying their brutality with abusive words, as for instance, "Now he can drink his fill." Were it not for divine assistance, Jesus would have been killed by the fall. He fell first on his knees and then on his face, so that he would have been severely wounded on the stony bed of the brook, which was here very shallow, if he had not saved himself a little by stretching out his previously tightly bound hands. They had been loosened from the girdle, I know not whether by divine help or whether by the executioners before they thrust him down. The marks of his knees, feet, elbows, and fingers were, by God's will, impressed upon the places that they touched, which later on became objects of veneration. Such things are no longer believed, but similar impressions in stone, made by the feet, the hands, and the knees of the patriarchs and prophets, made by Jesus, the Blessed Virgin, and some of the saints, have often been shown me in historical visions. The rocks were softer and more believing than the hearts of men. They bore witness at this terrible moment to the divine truth that had thus impressed them. I had not seen Jesus take anything to drink in the vehement thirst that consumed him after his awful agony in the Garden of Olives. But when pushed into the Cedron, I saw him drinking with difficulty, and at the same time, I heard him murmuring that thereby was fulfilled a prophetic verse from the Psalms, which bore reference to drinking from the torrent by the way. Meanwhile, the executioners relaxed not their hold on the long ropes that bound Jesus, and since it would have been difficult for them to draw him up again, and a wall on the opposite shore rendered it impossible for them to allow him to wade across, they dragged him by means of the ropes back through the Cedron. Then they went down themselves and hauled him up backwards over the high bank. And now, amid mocking and cursing, kicking and striking, those miserable wretches dragged poor Jesus forward with the ropes, a second time over the long bridge. His long woolen garment, heavy with water, clung so closely around his limbs that he could scarcely walk, and when he reached the opposite end of the bridge, he sank once more to the earth. They pulled him up again, striking him with the cords, and with shameful and ironical words, tucked up his wet garment into the girdle. They said, for example, something about his girding himself for the eating of the paschal lamb, and similar mockery. It was not yet midnight when I saw the 4 executioners dragging Jesus over a rugged, narrow road, along which ran only an uneven footpath. They dragged him over sharp stones and fragments of rocks, through thorns and thistles, inhumanly hurrying him on with curses and blows. The 6 brutal Pharisees were, wherever the road permitted it, always in his vicinity. Each carried in his hand a different kind of torturing stick with which he tormented him, thrusting him, goading him on, or beating him with it. While the executioners were dragging Jesus, his naked feet bleeding over sharp stones, thorns, and thistles, the scornful, satirical speeches of the 6 Pharisees were piercing his loving heart. It was at these moments they made use of such mockery as, his precursor, the Baptist, did not prepare a good way for him here. Or, why does he not raise John from the dead, that he may prepare the way for him? Such were the taunts uttered by these ignominious creatures, and received with rude shouts of laughter. They were caught up in turn by the executioners, who were incited thus to load poor Jesus with fresh ill usage. After the soldiers had driven the Lord forward for some time, they noticed several persons lurking around here and there in the distance. They were disciples who, upon the report of Jesus' arrest, had come from Bethphage and other hiding places to spy around and see how it was faring with their master. At sight of them, Jesus' enemies became anxious, lest they should make a sudden attack and rescue him. Therefore they signaled by a call to Ophel, a little place in the environs of Jerusalem, to send a reinforcement, as had been agreed upon. The procession was still distant some minutes from the entrance which, to the south of the temple, led through Ophel to Mount Sion, upon which Annas and Caiaphas dwelt, when I saw a band of 50 soldiers issuing from the gate, in order to reinforce their companions. They came forward in 3 groups. The first was 10 strong, the last 15, for I counted them, and the middle group 5 and 20. They bore several torches. They were bold and wanton in their bearing, and they shouted and hurrahed as they came along, as if to announce themselves to the approaching band and to congratulate them on their success. Their coming was a noisy one. At the moment in which the foremost band joined Jesus' escort, a slight confusion arose, and I saw Malchus and several others drop out of the rear and slip off in the direction of the Mount of Olives. When this shouting band hurried from Ophel by torchlight to meet the approaching procession, the disciples lurking around dispersed in all directions. I saw that the Blessed Virgin, in her trouble and anguish, with Martha, Magdalene, Mary Cleophas, Mary Salome, Mary Marcus, Susanna, Johanna Chusa, Veronica, and Salome, again directed her steps to the valley of Josaphat. They were to the south of Gethsemane, opposite that part of Mount Olivet, where was another grotto in which Jesus had formerly been accustomed to pray. I saw Lazarus, John Mark, Veronica's son, and Simeon's son with them. The last named, along with Nathanael, had been in Gethsemane with the 8 apostles and had fled across when the tumult began. They brought news to the Blessed Virgin. Meanwhile they heard the cries and saw the torches of the 2 bands as they met. The Blessed Virgin was in uninterrupted contemplation of Jesus' torments and sympathetic suffering with her divine Son. She allowed the holy women to lead her back part of the way, so that, when the tumultuous procession should have passed, she might again return to the house of Mary Marcus. The 50 soldiers belonged to a company of 300 men who had been sent at once to guard the gates and streets of Ophel and its surroundings, for Judas the traitor had drawn the high priest's attention to the fact that the inhabitants of Ophel, who were mostly poor artisans, day laborers, and carriers of wood and water to the temple, were the most attached partisans of Jesus. It might easily be feared, therefore, that some attempt would be made to free him as he passed through. The traitor knew very well that Jesus had here bestowed upon many of the poor laborers consolation, instruction, healing, and alms. It was also here in Ophel that Jesus had tarried when, after the murder of John the Baptist in Machaerus, he was journeying back from Bethania to Hebron. He had paused a while to console John's friends, and he had healed many of the poor day laborers and hod carriers who had been wounded at the overthrow of the great building and the Tower of Silo. Most of these people, after the descent of the Holy Ghost, joined the Christian community, and when the separation of the Christians from the Jews took place, and several settlements of the former were erected, they pitched their tents and built their huts across the valley as far as the Mount of Olives. Stephen resided there at that time. Ophel was on a hill south of the temple. It was surrounded by walls and inhabited principally by day laborers. It appeared to me to be not much smaller than Dulman. The good inhabitants of Ophel were roused by the shouts of the garrison as their companions entered. They hurried from their houses and pressed to the streets and gates held by the soldiers, asking the cause of the uproar. But here they met with a rough reception. The military rabble, made up of a mixture of low, insolent slaves, roughly and jeeringly drove them back to their dwellings. But as here and there they heard such remarks as these: "Jesus, the evildoer, your false prophet, is about to be led in a prisoner. The high priests will put an end to his proceedings. He will have to pay the penalty of the cross." The whole place was roused from sleep by the loud cries and lamentations of the people. The poor creatures, men and women, ran about wailing or with outstretched arms, cast themselves on their knees, crying to heaven and lauding Jesus' good deeds. The soldiers, thrusting them and dealing blows on all sides, drove them back to their homes, at the same time insulting Jesus and saying, "Here is an evident proof that he is an agitator of the people." They were, however, a little cautious in acting with the populace, through fear of rousing them by greater violence to open insurrection. Consequently, they aimed only at clearing the streets by which the procession was to pass through Ophel. Meanwhile, the ill-used Jesus and his barbarous escort came nearer and nearer to the gates of Ophel. Our Lord had repeatedly fallen to the earth, and he now appeared utterly unable to proceed farther. Taking advantage of this, a compassionate soldier said, "You see for yourselves that the poor man can go no farther. If we are to take him alive before the high priests, we must loosen the cords that bind his hands, that he may be able to support himself when he falls." While the procession halted for the executioners to loosen the cords, another good-hearted soldier brought him a drink of water from a neighboring well. He scooped it up in a vessel made of bark, formed into the shape of a cone, such as soldiers and travelers carried about them in that country, as drinking vessels. When Jesus said to this man a few words of acknowledgement, uttering at the same time some prophetic expressions about drinking from living fountains and the streams of living waters, the Pharisees mocked and reviled him, accusing him of vain boasting and blasphemy. He ought, they said, to give up his empty talk. He should never again give drink to a beast, much less to a human being. It was shown me that the two compassionate soldiers, through whose intervention his bands had been loosened and he had received a drink, were suddenly illuminated by grace. After Jesus' death they were converted, and later on joined the community in the capacity of disciples. I once knew their names, also those that they afterward bore as disciples, and their whole history, but it would be impossible to remember all that. It is too much. The procession again started forward, Jesus being ill-treated as before, and crossed a height up to the gates of Ophel. Here it was received by the heart-rending cries and lamentations of the inhabitants, who were bound to Jesus by a debt of gratitude. Only with great difficulty could the soldiers keep back the crowds of men and women pressing from all sides. They rushed forward wringing their hands, falling on their knees, and with outstretched arms, crying aloud, "Release unto us this man. Who will help us? Who will heal us? Who will console us? Release unto us this man." It was a heart-rending spectacle, Jesus pale, bruised, and disfigured, his hair torn, his robe wet and soiled, tucked up into his girdle, he himself dragged with ropes, urged on with blows, like a poor, fainting animal driven to sacrifice by insolent, half-naked executioners and overbearing soldiers. The latter were busy keeping off the crowd of lamenting and grateful people who were making their way to see Jesus, who were stretching out to him hands that he had cured of lameness, who were crying after him in supplicating tones with tongues that he had loosened from dumbness, who were gazing after him with eyes to which he had restored vision and which were now streaming with tears. Already in the vale of Cedron, numbers of filthy, ragged creatures from the lowest classes, excited by the soldiers and urged on by the followers of Annas, Caiaphas, and other enemies of Jesus, joined the procession with cries of mockery and derision. These newcomers now added their share of jeers and insults against the good people of Ophel. Ophel was built on a hill, for I saw in the center of it the highest point. It was an open place, and on it were all kinds of beams and rafters for building, like piles of wood in a carpenter yard. The procession now reached another gate in the wall, through which it wound somewhat downward. The people were prevented from following it beyond the city limits. The road now led somewhat into a valley. On the right stood a large building, I think the remains of Solomon's works, and to the left lay the pool of Bethsaida. After passing these, they kept on in a westerly direction down a steep street called Millo, and then, turning a little to the south, they ascended a flight of high steps to the Mount of Sion, upon which was the house of Annas. Along the way our Lord was abused and reviled, while the rabble that kept pouring from the city incited his vile custodians to multiplied cruelties. From the Mount of Olives to this point, Jesus fell to the ground 7 times. The inhabitants of Ophel were still full of terror and distress when a new scene excited their compassion. The Blessed Mother was, by the holy women and their friends, led through Ophel from the Vale of Cedron to the house of Mary Marcus, which stood at the foot of Mount Sion. When the good people recognized her, their compassion was aroused, and they sent up a wail of anguish. So great a crowd pressed around Mary and her companions that the mother of Jesus was almost carried in their arms. Mary was speechless with grief. She did not open her lips after she reached the house of Mary Marcus until the arrival of John. Then she began to ask questions and to give vent to her grief. John related to her everything that he had seen happen to Jesus from the moment that they left the conaculum up to the present. A little later she was conducted to Martha's house near that of Lazarus, at the west side of the city. They led her along unfrequented routes, in order to shun those by which Jesus was being dragged, and thus spare her the anguish of a meeting with him. Peter and John, who were following the procession at some distance, ran hurriedly when it entered the city to some of the good acquaintances whom John had among the servants of the high priests, to find in some way an opportunity of entering the judgment hall into which their master would soon be brought. These acquaintances of John were messengers attached to the court. They had now to scour the whole town in order to awaken the ancients of different ranks and many other personages, and call them to the council. They desired very much to please the 2 apostles, but could think of no other means of doing so than by supplying them with mantles such as they themselves wore, and letting them assist in calling the members of the council. Then, under cover of the mantle, they might enter with them into the judgment hall of Caiaphas, from which all were to be excluded, but the bribed rabble, the soldiers, and false witnesses. Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, and other well-disposed individuals belonged to the council, so that the apostles were able to deliver the summons to their master's friends, the only ones whom the Pharisees had perhaps designedly omitted from the list of the invited. Judas, meanwhile, the devil at his side, like a frantic malefactor, was wandering around the steep, wild precipices south of Jerusalem, where all the filth of the city was thrown.